Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel where today we are doing a full-length, non-spoilery review of The Silvered Serpents by Roshani Chokshi. So, The Silvered Serpents is the second book in the Gilded Wolves trilogy, which is a YA historical fantasy trilogy set in the 1890s-ish, and the first book is set in Paris, and this one is set more in like Serbia, Russia area, but we are following a group of older teens who are part of like a thief crew basically. But they basically solve puzzles and track down these lost artifacts and then go steal them. So very Indiana Jones rather than like Ocean's 11 kind of heist. But in this particular one, they are hot on the trail of this like what would end up being a monumental find for the magical world, but it also would be an incredible find for multiple people in this crew as it would help them progress towards their goals, I guess is the best way to say that. And so they travel to Serbia, Russia area to try to track it down. And the story goes from there. So like I said, this will be non-spoilery for this book, but there is one point where I will need to talk about some events that happen at the end of the first book so that we can talk about what's going on in this one. But when we get there, I will let you know just in case you haven't read the first book. So let us start with the world building. So the world building, the setting itself was really interesting. I felt like it was cold and barren. I truly felt it in my soul. Which was, so I thought that that part of it was really well done. We did get some more about the like extra history and culture of this particular world, especially as it relates to how Europe is interacting with like Russia, because that makes sense. But we didn't get quite as much as I was hoping for. Like, we got enough for the story and for the story to make sense, but not much more than that. And so, while I am appreciative that we got enough, I did, and I really was hoping for more. Um, Additionally, the big problem I had with world building in the last book was actually the magic system, in that it felt like there were no rules to it. And it still doesn't really have strict rules that we know about. However, I still think the magic system was done better in this particular book because, number one, it did not have a major impact on the plot for there to not be rules. So that was why it was such a big deal in the first book, because the magic system wasn't well defined, and because of how the plot went down, I feel like it needed to be a little bit more defined. But in this one, it's much less of a problem. It doesn't matter as much that it's not as defined, at least in relation to the plot. Additionally, how it was written, like, I can't really put my finger on any particular thing, but just how it was written felt a little bit more like there was an underlying set of rules that we were following, and just the audience doesn't really necessarily know those rules. So I do think that the magic system was written better in this particular book, even though it's still not particularly well defined. So overall, I thought that the world building was very solid. So let's move into characters. And this is like a character arc heavy book. This feels like what this book was really about, was doing more with these characters. And I really appreciated that. So speaking of our first perspective character, Zofia, her character arc is very beautiful, very realistic. But essentially, Zofia is autistic, and she's not really, like, it's not named that because we don't have that diagnosis until like 60 years in the future from when this book is set, but it's pretty obvious, and the author's note at the end of the last book did confirm it, that that's how she was written. But she is running into this issue of how do you be an independent adult when everybody who's taking care of you up until that point still views you as somebody that needs to be taken care of. And Zofia is really grappling with that. And that is a very realistic kind of arc to be having for anybody who has needed a lot of support growing up, is how do you move towards not relying on those supports. And so I really appreciated that. The other thing is that Zofia is Jewish, and I appreciated that there was more about that in this particular book. Still not a ton, but it felt almost ignored in the previous book, and it wasn't as much in this particular book, so I appreciated that as well. And then we have Enrique, and he's another perspective character, and his arc is much more a continuation of what we found in the first book, which is that he is half Spanish and half Filipino, so he is between these two worlds. He really doesn't fit in with either, and still trying to figure out his place. And he's really kind of struggling with that. Additionally, what he is trying to do, as he's trying to figure out his place between these two completely different cultures, he's trying to figure out what his place in the world at large is, and it's all kind of tangled together, but it's a really interesting thing. We didn't get a ton of resolution on it in this one, although he did make progress towards having some resolution, but I expect that we'll get the big resolution at the end of the next book. But I also really appreciate this arc as well. And then our next perspective character is Layla, and again, she's got a decent arc too. Now, I wasn't put as invested in it, but I still appreciated it. Basically, she's got this very straightforward thing, but additionally, she is also trying to learn to trust other people. The people that she has in her life now are not going to treat her the same as the people that she grew up with, which is a big deal. And she made baby steps towards kind of understanding that in this book, which was really nice to see. And then lastly, our last perspective character we have is Severin. And this is where we're going to get into some spoilers for the previous book. So go ahead and jump forward if you do not want to be spoiled. But essentially, his arc is very much a grief arc because he is obviously grieving his brother, Tristan, his adopted brother, and he feels a lot of guilt. He's got a lot of guilt wrapped up in that because he felt that he should have saved his brother rather than Layla, but then he can't really think about that because obviously he would have some real big issues if Layla had been the one to die. But yeah, he's in a very dark place in the beginning of this, and it's very, very realistic what he decides is the right answer. And it was interesting to kind of watch him interact with the others, and he does have small amounts of resolution to this arc by the end, which I did find made it much more bearable to read. But yeah, it was realistic. It was well written. It was very, very difficult to read, I found. So yeah, all of our perspective characters are having these really great character arcs. And additionally, we're finding out some more about hypnosis is motivation and why he's there and what he wants from the world. We learn much more about Madame Delphine Core, I think is her name. Basically the person who was an auntie to Severin when he was very, very young. We find out much more about her relationship with Severin and some of her motivations as well. And I found all of that to be very interesting. The one critique I had about the characters is just the villains, in that I don't know, they were just kind of there, honestly, and it wasn't exactly a surprise who the villains were. It was actually pretty obvious. I didn't really see it coming, but that's because I was focused on everything else. But after it was kind of the reveal of this is who's the bad person, I was just like, oh yeah, I probably should have guessed that. So I do think it could have been a little bit stronger, but I honestly don't think that it was a major problem, that it wasn't like a big surprise or anything. But they were just kind of a little bit bland in the way it was a little surprising how bland these villains kind of were. But overall, I do love the characters in this, and I love the character work that we are getting in these books. As for the plot, I thought that this was a very strong plot. I did have some issues. Like personally, I would have loved more puzzle solving than what we got. We got less than what we had in the first book, and also some of the stuff was like there weren't like the twists and turns were a little bit obvious. It wasn't anything super twisty turny or surprising or anything, but I did think that it was well written and it was a strong plot. So one of the things that I frequently have issues with trilogies is that the first book has a strong plot and the third book has a strong plot and the second one has a very weak plot that is meant to connect these other two books. And I did not find that in this. This had a very strong plot that was clearly part of the overarching plot, but was like its own thing, really. Like it had a very strong beginning, middle, and end, and it pushed this overarching plot forward, and it just felt like a very satisfying book on that plot side. So I really, really appreciate that aspect. And as for style, structure, and pacing, this is a pretty straightforward writing style, medium fast pace, and a multiple point of view book. As I mentioned, we do have 4 POVs. They are the same ones that we had in the Gilded Wolves. But overall, I really liked this book. I really enjoyed it. Once I kind of was able to sit down and really get into it, it just absolutely flew by. And I ended up giving this 4.5 stars. And I am absolutely so excited to get to the third book. But that is all I have for this review. So if you have any thoughts or feelings about this book, let me know down below. But that is all I have. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.